Part 1. At the birth of the Flying Fortress, the morning fog still clung to the runways of Boeing Field in Seattle when the machine first appeared like something from another era of warfare. In the early 1930s, the world stood uneasily between two wars, yet military planners already sensed that the next conflict would not be fought solely in trenches or on the seas. The sky itself was becoming a battlefield. Aircraft designers were racing to build machines capable of flying farther, carrying heavier payloads, and surviving the growing lethality of anti-aircraft defenses. Among these experiments emerged the bold concept: a bomber so heavily armed that it could defend itself deep inside enemy territory without escort. It was an audacious idea, bordering on fantasy. Yet from that vision, the Boeing Model 299 took shape, an aircraft that journalists would soon nickname the Flying Fortress. The prototype first roared to life in 1935, its four engines shaking the ground as mechanics and engineers stepped back in awe. With its long wingspan stretching across the tarmac and its gleaming aluminum fuselage reflecting the pale sunlight, the aircraft seemed almost futuristic. But it was the defensive armament that captured imaginations. Multiple machine gun positions protruded from the nose, belly, tail, and dorsal sections of the bomber, giving it the ability to fire in nearly every direction. The press, witnessing the aircraft during demonstration flights, described it as a fortress in the sky, an airborne citadel bristling with guns. Inside the cockpit, the crew would eventually number 10 men, each with a critical role. The pilot and co-pilot guided the massive machine across hostile skies. The navigator calculated courses through clouds and flak. The bombardier lay prone in the glass nose, peering through the Norden bomb site with the intense concentration of a surgeon preparing for an operation that could determine the fate of entire cities. Around them, gunners stood watch at their stations, scanning the horizon for the deadly silhouettes of enemy fighters. The United States Army Air Corps recognized the potential immediately. While early prototypes suffered accidents and bureaucratic skepticism, the concept proved too powerful to ignore. The world was sliding toward another catastrophic war, and the idea of striking the enemy's industrial heartland from the air was becoming central to American strategy. Factories, rail yards, oil refineries, these would become the targets of strategic bombing campaigns designed to cripple an enemy's ability to wage war. By the late 1930s, production lines began assembling the aircraft that would soon become known officially as the B-17 Flying Fortress. Rivets hammered into aluminum skins echoed across Boeing plants, while engineers refined the bomber's design, improving its engines, armament, and defensive capabilities. Each aircraft represented not only technological innovation but also a philosophical shift in warfare. Victory might now be determined not only by soldiers on the battlefield, but by bombers flying thousands of meters above it. Few who watched those early test flights could fully grasp what was coming. Within a few years, the skies of Europe would darken with formations of these bombers, their engines roaring like distant thunder as they carried the war deep into enemy territory. The Flying Fortress was no longer just an experimental aircraft, it was becoming a symbol of industrial power, of technological ambition, and of the brutal new reality of total war. Part 2. A war comes to the sky. When war finally erupted across Europe in 1939, the theories of strategic bombing were about to be tested in the harshest conditions imaginable. By the time the United States entered World War II after the attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, the B-17 was no longer an experimental machine, it was the backbone of America's growing aerial offensive. Factories across the United States worked day and night, producing thousands of bombers in assembly lines that symbolized the immense industrial capacity of the nation. Aluminum sheets, engines, machine guns, and wiring harnesses flowed together like pieces of a giant mechanical puzzle. Young men from farms, cities, and universities were trained to fly these aircraft. Many were barely in their 20s. After months of rigorous training in navigation, formation flying, and bombing procedures, they were sent across the Atlantic to join the 8th Air Force in England. There, on damp airfields surrounded by hedgerows and small villages, the crews prepared for missions that would carry them deep into Nazi-occupied Europe. The strategy was clear: daylight precision bombing. Unlike the British Royal Air Force, which increasingly bombed cities at night. American planners believed that the Norden bomb site could deliver bombs with surgical accuracy during daylight hours. The B-17, heavily armed and flying in tight defensive formations, was expected to protect itself against German fighters while striking vital industrial targets. But theory and reality often collided violently in war. On mission days, the airfields buzz with nervous energy before dawn. Ground crews loaded bombs into the cabinets bays beneath the fuselage while mechanics checked engines and control surfaces. Pilots gathered for briefings in dimly lit rooms where maps displayed the day's target, perhaps a ball-bearing factory in Schwert, a submarine yard in Bremen, or oil facilities in the Ruhr Valley. When the engines started, the sound was overwhelming. 4 Wright Cyclone engines per aircraft roared simultaneously as dozens of bombers lined up along the runway. The smell of fuel and exhaust filled the cold morning air. One by one, the aircraft lifted off into the gray English sky, climbing slowly until they assembled into massive formations. From the ground, these formations resembled metallic clouds moving across the sky. From inside the aircraft, the scene was both awe-inspiring and terrifying. Rows of B-17s stretched across the horizon, each maintaining precise position within the formation to maximize defensive firepower. But beyond the English coast lay enemy territory and danger. German radar stations detected the incoming bombers long before they reached their targets. Soon, squadrons of Luftwaffe fighters climbed to intercept them. Messerschmitt Bf-109s and Focke-Wulf Fw-190s approached at terrifying speeds, their cannons flashing as they attacked the formations. Inside the B-17s, gunners braced themselves. The sky erupted in chaos, tracers streaking through the air, explosions of flak bursting like black flowers around the bombers. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, temperatures plunged below freezing. Oxygen masks fogged with each breath as crews struggled to maintain focus amid the violence unfolding outside their windows. The theory of the flying fortress was about to face its ultimate test. Part 3A. Into the firestorm. The moment the bomber formation crossed into enemy airspace, the sky itself seemed to turn hostile. German anti-aircraft batteries opened fire from miles below, launching shells that climbed through the atmosphere before detonating at bomb-more altitude. Each explosion produced a violent burst of black smoke and razor-sharp shrapnel. The Americans called it flak, a term that would soon become synonymous with fear among bomber crews. Inside a B-17, every crew member understood the stakes. The aircraft was tough and legendary for its ability to absorb damage, but it was not invincible. Flak fragments tore through aluminum skins, severed control cables, and punctured fuel tanks. The sound was unmistakable, the sudden metallic hammering against the fuselage, like a giant striking the aircraft with invisible fists. Yet the B-17 had been designed for precisely this environment. Its multiple gun positions allowed defensive fire from nearly every angle. When enemy fighters approached, the gunners responded instantly. The nose gunner leaned forward into his sights. The dorsal turret rotated with mechanical precision. Tail gunners watched the 6 o'clock position with relentless vigilance. A single bomber carried up to 13 machine guns. When dozens of aircraft flew together in formation, their overlapping fields of fire created a deadly defensive web. German pilots learned quickly that attacking these formations head-on was among the most dangerous maneuvers in aerial combat. Still, the Luftwaffe adapted. Fighters attacked from the front, firing heavy cannons capable of destroying bombers in seconds. Rockets were launched from long range to break up the formations. Some interceptors even attempted ramming attacks in desperation. Amid this chaos, the bombardier waited. As the formation approached its target, tension inside the aircraft intensified. The bombardier lay in the nose compartment, peering through the Norden bomb site. Below him stretched cities, factories, railways, and industrial landscape transformed into military objectives. Bombs away. The words echoed through the aircraft as the bomb bay doors opened. One by one, the bombs fell toward the earth below, their paths calculated with mathematical precision. For a brief moment, the aircraft grew lighter, rising slightly as the deadly cargo disappeared beneath the clouds. But the mission was only half complete. The bombers still had to survive the journey home. Part 4 At the Cost of Daylight. The doctrine of daylight precision bombing promised accuracy and efficiency, but the price paid by bomber crews was staggering. During the early years of the war, B-17 formations often flew without long-range fighter escort deep into German territory. The results were devastating. Missions such as the infamous Regensburg raids in 1943 demonstrated both the strength and vulnerability of the Flying Fortress. As the bombers approached heavily defended industrial targets, the sky filled with German fighters determined to break the formations apart. Without escorting fighters to drive them away, the Luftwaffe concentrated its attacks on the bombers' most vulnerable angles. Cannons tore through aluminum skins, engines erupted into flames, and aircraft began to fall from the sky. From inside the formations, the sight was unforgettable. A bomber struck by heavy fire might suddenly drop out of formation, trailing smoke as crew members struggled desperately to maintain control. Sometimes parachutes appeared as small white blossoms drifting slowly toward the earth below. Other times, the aircraft simply vanished in a burst of fire. Loss rates during some missions exceeded 20%. For the young men flying these aircraft, survival was never guaranteed. A full combat tour required completing 25 missions, an achievement that seemed almost impossible during the darkest months of the war. Yet the bombers kept flying. Part 5 At the Fortress proves its strength. Despite these brutal losses, the B-17 earned a reputation for extraordinary resilience. Stories circulated among crews about aircraft returning to base with massive holes in their wings, missing sections of tail, or engines destroyed. The bomber's rugged construction often allowed it to survive damage that would have destroyed other aircraft. One famous example involved a B-17 that returned to England with nearly half its tail missing, yet still landed safely. Another aircraft limped home with only 2 engines functioning after being riddled with flak. Photographs of these battered machines became legendary symbols of the aircraft's toughness. The Flying Fortress had become more than just a weapon. It was a lifeline for the crews who depended on it to carry them home. Part 6 A Victory in the Sky. By 1944, the strategic bombing campaign had reached unprecedented scale. Thousands of bombers crossed the skies of Europe in coordinated waves, striking oil refineries, transportation networks, and aircraft factories essential to the German war machine. With the arrival of long-range escort fighters such as the P-51 Mustang, the bombers finally had protection deep inside enemy territory. The balance of air power began to shift. German fighter forces were increasingly overwhelmed, and the destruction of fuel supplies crippled the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its skies. The Flying Fortress had become a central instrument in the Allied strategy to dismantle Nazi Germany's industrial capacity. Part 7 At the Legacy of the Flying Fortress. When the war finally ended in 1945, the B-17 had flown hundreds of thousands of missions across Europe and the Pacific. Cities lay in ruins, factories destroyed, and the strategic bombing campaign had permanently reshaped the nature of modern warfare. Yet the true legacy of the Flying Fortress was not measured only in tons of bombs dropped or targets destroyed. It was written in the stories of the men who flew these aircraft, the young crews who faced freezing temperatures, enemy fighters, and relentless flak with a mixture of courage, fear, and determination. Today, the surviving B-17s that still fly at air shows carry more than historical significance. When their engines start and their propellers begin to spin, the sound echoes across decades of history. It reminds us of a time when the skies of Europe were filled with roaring engines and the fate of nations hung in the balance. The Flying Fortress was not merely an aircraft, it was a symbol of an era when technology, bravery, and sacrifice converged in the cold air thousands of meters above the earth. And even now, when one of these aircraft rises slowly into the sky, its silhouette against the sun recalls a distant thunder that once changed the world forever.